In February 2001, over 20 gunshots shattered a New York street as the heavily armed entourage of rap icon Lil' Kim and the crew of rival rapper Capone opened fire on each other outside the Hot 97 radio station. This daylight bloodbath wasn't just a petty rivalry, it is the dark, untold story of how the media pushed Lil' Kim and Foxy Brown directly into federal prison. Record labels and radio executives deliberately pitted the two childhood friends against each other, manipulating their pride to engineer a toxic multi-million-dollar media rivalry for ratings, completely oblivious to the fatal street consequences. By the time the smoke cleared, this manufactured hatred had destroyed their pioneering careers, leaving Lil' Kim locked in a concrete cell and Foxy Brown entirely discarded. It is a terrifying lesson in corporate greed. When the bullets fly, the artists do the time, while the executives simply stand back and count the cash. But those 20 bullets were merely the final act of a long, calculated corporate play. The roots of this manufactured destruction lie far from federal indictments, buried deep in the gritty, male-dominated landscape of Brooklyn. The East Coast hip-hop scene was entering its golden era. It was a cultural renaissance that was aggressively, unapologetically male-dominated. The narratives were driven by hardened men, telling stories of street survival, territorial dominance, and gang loyalty. Women in this industry were routinely relegated to the margins. They were the background singers, the video extras, or the romantic interests. To step up to a microphone as a woman and demand the same respect, the same money, and the same fear as a male rapper was an act of profound defiance. It required a level of psychological armor that few possessed. Enter Kimberly Denise Jones and Inga DeCarlo Fung Marchand. Kimberly, who would soon be known to the world as Lil' Kim, was born in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn, in 1974. Her early life was marked by instability. After her parents separated, she lived with her father, a strict and often difficult man. She eventually left home as a teenager, dropping out of school and surviving on the unforgiving streets of New York. It was a grueling existence, but it forged in her a survival instinct that was absolute. That instinct caught the attention of Christopher Wallace, famously known as the Notorious B.I.G. He saw beyond her petite frame. He saw a raw, unfiltered talent and a ferocious loyalty. He brought her into his collective, Junior MAFIA, and became her mentor, her protector, and her lover. Under his guidance, Lil' Kim learned to weaponize her sexuality and her street smarts, rapping with a graphic, unapologetic bravado that shocked conservative America and thrilled a generation of young women. A few miles away, Inga Marchand was coming of age in Park Slope. Born in 1978, 4 years younger than Kim, Inga possessed a husky, commanding voice and a precocious confidence that belied her youth. While still a teenager, she won a local talent contest that led to her discovery by the production team Trackmasters. She adopted the moniker Foxy Brown, an homage to the fierce, independent blaxploitation film character of the 1970s. Her rise was meteoric. Before she even had a record deal, she was holding her own on tracks with established heavyweights like LL, Cool J, and Jay-Z. Foxy was incredibly young, still in high school when she signed her first major contract with Def Jam Recordings, but she commanded the microphone with the authority of a seasoned veteran. In the beginning, before the money and the media tore them apart, Lil' Kim and Foxy Brown were friends. They were sisters in arms. They navigated the treacherous waters of the mid-95 music industry together. They understood each other's unique pain and isolation in a way no one else could. They knew what it was like to be the only woman in a recording studio filled with older, powerful men. They knew the pressure of having to constantly prove their authenticity, of having to write lyrics that were harder, sharper, and more aggressive than their male counterparts just to be taken seriously. They shared the immense, suffocating weight of being young black women tasked with carrying multi-million-dollar record labels on their shoulders. There is a fragile, beautiful memory from this era that highlights what was lost. Kim and Foxy appeared on a landmark cover of the Source magazine in 1997, standing alongside other pioneering women in hip-hop to project a united front of female empowerment. Behind closed doors, they spoke on the telephone constantly. They gave each other advice on contracts, on dealing with producers, and on handling the sudden, terrifying rush of global fame. They even discussed recording a collaborative album conceptually titled Thelma and Louise. It was meant to be a musical testament to their brotherhood, a project that would have cemented their joint reign over New York. They were poised to rule the industry together, proving that there was enough room at the top for more than one queen. But the corporate architecture of the music business had a different, much darker plan. The executives at Bad Boy Records and Def Jam, along with the editors of the major hip-hop publications, operated on a toxic, patriarchal narrative. It was an unwritten rule of the industry, born out of deep-seated misogyny. While there could be dozens of successful male rappers coexisting and collaborating, there could only be one female rapper at the top, the Highlander rule. There can be only one. The executives realized very quickly that a united front between Kim and Foxy was culturally powerful, but a bitter rivalry was far more profitable. Controversy creates cash. The media began to draw constant, exhausting comparisons. The release schedules for their debut albums were weaponized. Lil' Kim's Hardcore and Foxy Brown's Il Na Na were deliberately pushed into the market just 1 week apart in November 1996. It was a manufactured collision. From that moment on, the magazines pitted them against each other. If Lil' Kim wore a specific European designer and Foxy Brown wore something similar a month later, the press ran sensational headlines accusing them of stealing styles. If one achieved a platinum plaque, reporters immediately shoved microphones into the other's face, demanding a reaction. They were constantly graded on their sales, their lyrics, their bodies, and their proximity to the powerful men who backed them. The record labels did absolutely nothing to protect their young artists from this toxic scrutiny. In fact, they encouraged it. They understood the psychology of their audience. A rivalry between two highly sexualized, aggressive, and incredibly talented women was a marketing goldmine. It sold magazines, it drove radio requests, and it forced fans to pick a side, which in turn drove up album sales as each camp tried to outpurchase the other. The subtle jabs and media-manufactured tension soon began to trigger genuine, deep-seated insecurities in both women. When you are constantly told by the world that the woman standing next to you is trying to steal your crown, your livelihood, and your legacy, paranoia is inevitable. Lil' Kim, already dealing with the immense trauma of the volatile environment around Bad Boy Records, and the looming threat of violence that characterized the East Coast-West Coast hip-hop war, felt fiercely protective of her territory. Foxy Brown, thrust into global superstardom, while barely out of childhood, felt the desperate need to prove that she was not a second-tier act, but the rightful heir to the throne. The friendship slowly dissolved, replaced by a cold, paranoid silence. The Thelma and Louise album was quietly abandoned. The late-night phone calls stopped. The corporate machine had successfully driven a wedge between them, isolating them in their respective camps. Lil' Kim was surrounded by the junior MAFIA, fiercely loyal to the legacy of Biggie Smalls. Foxy Brown was entrenched in the firm, a supergroup backed by Dr. Dre and the heavyweights of Def Jam. They were no longer two girls from Brooklyn trying to make it out of poverty. They were the generals of two opposing corporate armies, armed with microphones and multi-million-dollar marketing budgets. The media had built the gladiator arena. They had handed these two women the weapons. Now, the executives sat back in their corner offices, waiting for the first drop of blood. They would not have to wait long. The manufactured tension of the late 90s was about to cross the line from corporate marketing into dangerous, uncontrollable street politics. And it would start, as all hip-hop wars do, with a voice on a record. The silence that fell between Lil' Kim and Foxy Brown in the late 1990s was not a peaceful one. It was the heavy, suffocating silence that precedes a detonation. As the media actively tore their friendship apart, replacing late-night phone calls with tabloid headlines, the battleground shifted to the recording booths. In the golden era of East Coast hip-hop, you did not issue press releases to air your grievances. You put them on wax, and the executives in the corner offices knew exactly how to monetize this subliminal warfare. To understand the sheer ferocity of the collision that was coming, one must understand the devastating trauma that shattered Lil' Kim's world in March 1997. Christopher Wallace, the notorious B.I.G., was gunned down in Los Angeles. For the global music industry, it was the tragic loss of a generational icon. But for Kimberly Jones, it was the violent theft of her mentor, her protector, and the love of her life. Biggie was the architect of her confidence. He had plucked her from the streets of Brooklyn and placed a crown on her head. His murder left her emotionally devastated and fiercely, almost dangerously protective of his legacy and the junior MAFIA crew he left behind. Kim was thrust into the role of the matriarch for her collective, bearing the immense weight of keeping the Bad Boy Records dynasty relevant while drowning in personal grief. She became hyper-vigilant. In the hyper-masculine, predatory world of the music industry, weakness was an invitation for destruction. Kim wrapped herself in a bulletproof vest of extreme glamour and aggressive sexuality. She could not afford to let anyone, especially another female artist, challenge the throne that Biggie had helped her build. Simultaneously, Foxy Brown was facing her own crushing corporate pressures over at Def Jam Recordings. She was expected to carry the mantle of the ultimate female rap superstar. Foxy was incredibly young, thrust into adult situations and multi-million-dollar negotiations while still navigating her own coming of age. The executives at Def Jam, helmed by figures who viewed artists as highly profitable, disposable assets, constantly pushed her to be harder, sexier, and more controversial. She was surrounded by older male figures, mentors, managers, and producers who whispered in her ear that she was the true queen of New York and that Lil' Kim was merely a rival trying to steal her demographic. The industry effectively placed these two grieving, pressured, and isolated young women in a pressure cooker and welded the lid shut. The subliminal disses began to bleed into their music. It started subtly, disguised as competitive boasting. A lyric here about wearing better diamonds, a bar there about selling more records. But the hip-hop magazines, publications like The Source, Vibe, and XXL, acted as the instigators. Whenever Kim or Foxy dropped a guest verse, journalists would immediately dissect the lyrics, printing side-by-side comparisons and asking, was this a shot at Kim? Or did Foxy just dethrone the Queen Bee? The media functioned as a highly profitable echo chamber. They knew that female rivalry sold exponentially better than female solidarity. They capitalized on the deeply ingrained societal misogyny that loves to watch women tear each other apart. If Kim arrived at the 1999 MTV Video Music Awards wearing her now iconic purple mermaid jumpsuit with an exposed breast and a pasty, the media immediately demanded Foxy's reaction. If Foxy released an album cover dripping in high-fashion furs, the press accused her of copying Kim's aesthetic. They were two women from the same borough, operating in the exact same genre, marketed to the exact same audience. The collision was not accidental. It was mathematically engineered by the men who owned their publishing rights. As the new millennium dawned, the tension escalated from Cold War to active combat. Both women were preparing to release highly anticipated sophomore projects. Lil' Kim dropped the notorious K.I.M. in the summer of 2000, an album deeply heavily influenced by her grief over Biggie and her determination to prove she could survive without him. Foxy Brown was preparing her third studio album, Broken Silence. The stakes were astronomically high. Millions of dollars in marketing budgets were on the line, and the entourages surrounding both women began to swell. This is a crucial element of the tragedy. In the hardcore hip-hop scene of New York, an artist is rarely just an individual. They are the financial anchor for an entire ecosystem of friends, bodyguards, childhood associates, and neighborhood loyalists. Lil' Kim was protected by the junior MAFIA and a robust crew from Bedford-Stuyvesant. Foxy Brown ran with a formidable entourage from her own Brooklyn neighborhood. These men were fiercely protective of their respective female stars, not just out of loyalty, but because the artists were their meal tickets. If their artist's reputation was damaged, the money stopped flowing. Consequently, the entourages often acted as accelerants, feeding the artist's paranoia and demanding violent retribution for any perceived disrespect. The artists became the figureheads, the entourages became the standing armies. The point of no return, the catalyst that transformed this media-driven rivalry into a genuine street war, arrived in late 2000. The Queensbridge rap duo Capone and Noreaga, widely known as CNN, were recording their highly anticipated album, The Reunion. They invited Foxy Brown to feature on a track titled Bang Bang. The beat was aggressive, dark, and menacing. It was the perfect auditory backdrop for a street anthem. But when Foxy stepped into the vocal booth, she did not just deliver a standard guest verse. She delivered a targeted, calculated execution. In her verse on Bang Bang, Foxy Brown crossed the invisible line that separates a competitive rap battle from a personal violation. She explicitly mocked Lil' Kim. She questioned Kim's street credibility. But worst of all, she made callous, thinly veiled references to Kim's grief and her relationship with the deceased notorious B.I.G. She targeted the junior MAFIA directly, dismissing them as weak and irrelevant. In the culture of East Coast hip-hop, this was not a publicity stunt. This was a declaration of war. You cannot mock a grieving woman's dead mentor. You cannot insult a Brooklyn crew's street credibility on a record that is going to be pumped through the speakers of every car, club, and radio station in the 5 boroughs. Foxy's verse struck at the very core of Kim's identity and her trauma. It was a humiliation tactic designed to force a response, and it worked perfectly for the corporate machine. When Bang Bang hit the streets, the radio stations played it relentlessly. The DJs did not censor the aggression, they highlighted it, rewinding the track and hyping up the disrespect. The record label executives watched their sales projections soar. They had finally gotten the blood they wanted. For Lil' Kim, the release of Bang Bang was an absolute humiliation that could not be ignored. Her pride, her grief, and the fierce loyalty of her entourage demanded action. The junior MAFIA felt deeply disrespected by Foxy and the CNN crew. The streets of New York were talking, and in their world, silence is equated with cowardice. The tension in Brooklyn and Manhattan became thick, palpable, and dangerous. The music industry had successfully taken 2 talented young women and placed them in a situation where their physical safety and their street reputations were inextricably linked to violence. The corporate machine had wound the toy soldiers up, and now they were walking blindly towards the edge of the table. This brings us to the architecture of the tragedy, the radio station. In 2001, Hot 97 was not just a frequency on the FM dial. It was the absolute undisputed town square of global hip-hop. It was the kingmaker. If Hot 97 played your record, you went platinum. If Hot 97 ignored you, your career died. The station operated out of a nondescript building on Hudson Street in Manhattan, but its cultural power was immense. The programmers and DJs at Hot 97 were fully aware of the lethal tension between the Lil' Kim and Foxy Brown camps and the escalating beef with the Capone and Noreaga crew. They played the diss tracks. They discussed the rumors on air. They were the primary instigators of the drama, profiting directly from the listener engagement that the feud generated. The management at Hot 97 understood that proximity breeds conflict. They understood that if you put rival factions in the same room, you get an exclusive story that competing stations cannot match. The date was February 26, 2001. Lil' Kim was scheduled to appear at the Hot 97 studios for a live interview to promote her latest projects. She arrived with her standard heavy entourage. Her manager, Damian D. Rock Butler, and her bodyguard, Swift Gouda Jackson, were by her side. They were not there just to carry bags. They were there to provide a physical, intimidating barrier between Kim and the volatile world the media had created for her. They were on high alert. The streets were hot, the diss track was currently in heavy rotation, and the threat of retaliation was hanging in the freezing New York air. At the exact same time, Capone, the very rapper whose album featured the vicious Foxy Brown diss track that had ignited this powder keg, was also scheduled to be at the Hot 97 building. For decades, cultural historians, legal experts, and industry insiders have fiercely debated the nature of this scheduling. Was it a colossal negligent administrative error? Or was it a deliberate, cynical ploy by the radio station's booking department to schedule the queen bee and the man who facilitated her most humiliating public disrespect to walk through the exact same narrow lobby on the exact same afternoon is an act of breathtaking recklessness. Many believe the station wanted the two camps to cross paths. They wanted the shouting match. They wanted the bodyguards to posture and push each other. They wanted the artists to exchange words so the DJs could immediately go on air and broadcast the exclusive drama to millions of listeners across the tri-state area. They wanted a show. But the corporate executives sitting safely in their soundproof studios fundamentally misunderstood the volatility of the people they were manipulating. They treated street politics like professional wrestling, assuming the violence was purely performative. They forgot that the men standing behind these female artists did not carry prop guns. They carried real, loaded illegal firearms, and they were willing to use them to protect their reputations and their livelihoods. As Lil' Kim concluded her interview, the atmosphere inside her camp was tense. They moved toward the elevators, a tight-knit phalanx of loyalty and paranoia, ready to exit the building and return to the safety of their waiting limousines. Simultaneously, Capone and his own heavily armed entourage were arriving at the station. They walked through the glass doors on Hudson Street, stepping into the lobby. The collision was inevitable. The explosive environment had been perfectly primed. Two rival armies, heavily armed, emotionally volatile, and convinced by the media that they were locked in a fight to the death, were about to share the same oxygen in a confined space. The record executives had pushed the artists to the absolute brink, and now they were going to let the street handle the rest. The elevator doors opened into the lobby of the Hot 97 building on Hudson Street. It was precisely 3 p.m. Lil' Kim, flanked by her manager Damian D-Rock Butler, and her heavily built bodyguard, Sweef Gouda Jackson, stepped forward, ready to exit the corporate fortress and return to their waiting limousines. But the lobby was no longer a neutral space. Standing directly in their path was Capone, the Queensbridge rapper, who had just provided the platform for Foxy Brown's most vicious, humiliating public attack on Kim. Capone was not alone. He was surrounded by his own formidable entourage. In the confined, polished marble space of a Manhattan office building, the two warring factions collided. The scheduling might have been a cynical ploy for ratings, but the executives upstairs critically underestimated the lethal reality of the streets they were exploiting. There was no shouting match. In the hardcore hip-hop environment of 2001, when a mortal insult has been issued on a record, words are no longer sufficient. Eyeballs locked. The tension in the lobby spiked from uncomfortable to lethal in a fraction of a second. According to witness testimonies, a member of Capone's entourage exchanged a harsh look with one of Kim's associates. A single aggressive question was asked. "What are you looking at?" That was the spark. The group spilt out through the heavy glass doors onto the cold concrete of Hudson Street, right into the middle of the bustling afternoon commute. Then, the corporate fantasy of a rap beef violently transformed into a real-world bloodbath. Weapons were drawn with terrifying speed. These were not props. They were 9mm and .38 caliber handguns, fully loaded and wielded by men who had grown up in environments where hesitation meant death. The first shot rang out, a deafening crack that echoed off the towering Manhattan skyscrapers. It was immediately followed by a chaotic, relentless barrage. Over 20 rounds of ammunition tore through the winter air in broad daylight. Civilians, businessmen, and tourists screamed in absolute terror, throwing themselves onto the pavement and crawling behind parked cars as the glass doors of the radio station shattered into thousands of jagged pieces. The air filled with the sharp, acrid smell of cordite. In the crossfire, Effian Crockett, a man associated with Capone's crew, took a bullet directly to the back. He collapsed onto the pavement, bleeding heavily into the New York street. Amidst the deafening roar of the gunfire, Lil Kim was grabbed by her surviving security detail. She was physically shoved into the back of her waiting stretch limousine, her designer clothes scraping against the leather as the driver slammed his foot onto the accelerator. The vehicle sped away from the carnage, running red lights as police sirens began to wail in the distance, converging on the shattered radio station. The shootout lasted less than 60 seconds, but the cultural and legal shockwaves it generated would last for decades. As the ambulances arrived to treat the bleeding man on the pavement, the reaction from the corporate entities surrounding this feud was chillingly pragmatic. One might expect that a daylight shootout involving automatic weapons outside a major media conglomerate would prompt a moment of profound industry reflection. One might expect the record labels and the radio programmers to publicly condemn the violence, pull the inflammatory tracks from the airwaves, and separate the artists to prevent further loss of life. They did the exact opposite. They monetized the blood. Within hours of the shooting, Hot 97 was broadcasting the news as if it were a blockbuster movie premiere. The DJs breathlessly reported the details of the gunfight, looping snippets of Capone and Foxy Brown's Bang Bang track in between news updates. The song that had incited the violence was not banned. It was placed on heavy rotation. It became the unofficial soundtrack to the shootout. The hip-hop magazines went to print with explosive, sensational front covers. They splashed crime scene photos across their glossy pages, printing detailed diagrams of where the bullet casings had fallen. Def Jam and Bad Boy Records saw their artists' profiles skyrocket in infamy. The danger associated with Lil Kim and Foxy Brown was no longer a marketing gimmick. It was authenticated by real bullets and real police tape. Sales of their albums spiked. The executives sitting in their secure, bulletproof offices in Midtown Manhattan were not bleeding. They were not dodging federal agents. They were celebrating a massive, unprecedented surge in consumer engagement. The system had successfully driven two black women to the brink of mutual destruction, and the resulting explosion was a financial triumph. But the corporate executives had forgotten a crucial variable in their ruthless equation: the federal government. The New York Police Department arrived at Hudson Street and immediately realized they were not dealing with a standard street corner altercation. This was a highly publicized, brazen act of violence in a commercial district involving multi-million-dollar entertainers. The case was quickly elevated, drawing the attention of the FBI and the United States Attorney's Office. The authorities were determined to make an example of the hip-hop industry. For years, politicians and law enforcement agencies had been trying to crack down on the gangsta rap culture that they believed was corrupting American youth. The Hot 97 shootout handed them the perfect high-profile opportunity to flex their muscle and break the perceived immunity of the rap world. The investigators began to methodically reconstruct the crime scene. They interviewed terrified pedestrians. They collected the scattered shell casings. But most importantly, they acquired the grainy black and white CCTV footage from the security cameras mounted outside the radio station. When the federal agents reviewed the tape, they found exactly what they were looking for. The footage was chaotic, but in the crucial frames leading up to and during the gunfire, two men were clearly identifiable. One was holding a weapon, and the other was actively firing into the crowd. The agents ran the faces through their databases and matched them to the entourage that had arrived with the Queen Bee. The shooters were Damian D. Rock Butler and Sweef Gouda Jackson. The federal prosecutors had the shooters dead to rights, but they did not just want the bodyguards. They wanted the prize. They wanted to publicly humiliate a hip-hop icon and force the culture to bow to federal authority. They knew that Lil' Kim was the financial and emotional anchor for these men. They knew that in the unwritten, deeply entrenched code of the Brooklyn streets, you do not cooperate with the police, and you absolutely do not testify against your own crew. The feds saw a golden opportunity to trap her. They issued a federal subpoena, compelling Kimberly Denise Jones to appear before a grand jury. The grand jury is a terrifying, highly secretive legal mechanism. It is not a trial. There is no judge, and the witness's defense attorney is not allowed inside the room. The witness sits alone, facing a panel of jurors and a ruthless federal prosecutor whose sole objective is to extract an indictment. If you refuse to answer, you can be jailed for contempt. If you lie under oath, you commit perjury, a federal felony carrying severe prison time. Lil' Kim was forced to sit down with her high-priced defense attorneys to evaluate her options. The reality they presented to her was bleak, oppressive, and utterly devoid of a favorable outcome. The government did not necessarily care if she had pulled a trigger. They knew she hadn't. They wanted her to explicitly identify D-Rock and Gouda as the shooters. She was trapped in a suffocating psychological vice. On one side stood the full, terrifying weight of the United States federal justice system. On the other side stood the code of the streets, the junior MAFIA, and the legacy of the notorious BIG. To understand the agonizing weight of her choice, you must understand what those men represented to her. D-Rock and Gouda were not just employees on a payroll. They were the men who had protected her when she was a vulnerable teenager surviving in Bedford-Stuyvesant. When she ascended to global fame, they were the human shields who stood between her and the obsessive fans, the rival gangs, and the predators of the music industry. When Biggie was murdered, these men had formed a protective wall around her, ensuring her physical and emotional survival. To walk into a federal courthouse and point the finger at them would be an act of profound, unforgivable betrayal. It would violate the very core of her identity. It would mean turning her back on the people who had kept her alive. But her lawyers pleaded with her to look at the cold, hard facts. She was a multi-platinum artist. She had a sprawling mansion in New Jersey, lucrative endorsement deals, and a career that was generating millions of dollars. If she lied to the grand jury, she was risking it all. The prosecutors explicitly warned her legal team that they possessed the CCTV footage They knew the truth. They were actively setting a perjury trap. It was the ultimate collision of worlds. The corporate boardroom logic dictated that she should save herself, preserve the brand, and let the bodyguards take the fall. That is what a CEO would do. But Lil Kim was not a CEO. She was a product of a culture that values loyalty above life itself. As the date of her grand jury testimony approached, the pressure became unbearable. The media continued to fan the flames of her feud with Foxy Brown, entirely oblivious to the fact that Lil Kim was quietly fighting a battle for her fundamental freedom. Foxy, meanwhile, was experiencing her own terrifying descent, dealing with the sudden catastrophic loss of her hearing and the chilling realization that her record label was preparing to abandon her. Both women, once the queens of New York, were now isolated in their own private hells, slowly being crushed by the consequences of a war they had been manipulated into fighting. On the morning of her grand jury appearance, Lil Kim dressed impeccably. She wore the armor of high fashion, projecting the image of the untouchable queen bee. She walked past the flashing cameras of the paparazzi, through the heavy revolving doors of the federal courthouse, and into the stark wood-paneled room where the prosecutors were waiting. She raised her right hand. She swore an oath to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. The prosecutor leaned forward, holding a photograph extracted from the CCTV footage. It showed a man with a gun outside the Hot 97 radio station. The prosecutor looked directly at the woman who had conquered the music industry and asked a very simple, lethal question. Ms. Jones, do you recognize the men in this photograph? In that silent, breathless moment inside the grand jury room, Lil Kim held her entire future in her hands. She could have chosen a path of self-preservation. She could have told the government exactly what they wanted to hear, walked out of the courthouse, and returned to her platinum records and her glamorous life. But the corporate executives who had pushed her to this point never understood the depth of the trauma and loyalty that bound her to her crew. They thought she was just a product. They didn't realize she was a soldier. When she looked at that photograph, she didn't see criminals. She saw the men who had caught her when Biggie died, and in a decision that would ultimately cost her her freedom, her prime earning years, and her throne, Lil Kim chose the code of the streets over the laws of the state. She opened her mouth to answer the prosecutor, and with a single sentence, she sealed her own tragic fate. The trap snapped shut. Ms. Jones, do you recognize the men in this photograph? The federal prosecutor's voice was flat, echoing slightly in the sterile wood-paneled grand jury room. Lil Kim looked down at the image. It was a still frame pulled directly from the security cameras outside the Hot 97 radio station. The footage was grainy, but the faces were unmistakable to anyone who knew them. There was Damian D. Rock Butler, her manager and confidant. There was Sweef Gouda Jackson, her imposing bodyguard. They were captured in the chaotic moments of the Greenwich Street shootout, holding firearms. The government knew exactly who these men were. The prosecutor knew exactly who these men were. They were not asking for information. They were asking for a confession of complicity. Kimberly Jones looked at the photograph, and then she looked back at the prosecutor. She did not flinch. She did not break eye contact. No, she answered. She testified under oath that she did not notice Butler or Jackson at the scene of the shootout. She claimed she could not recognize the men in the photographs. She told the grand jury that she had no idea her own manager and her own bodyguard were involved in a 20-gun salute in broad daylight, mere feet away from her. It was a staggering, audacious lie delivered directly into the teeth of the United States federal government. To the outside observer, a corporate executive or an ordinary citizen, this decision seems incomprehensibly foolish. Why would a multi-platinum, globally recognized superstar risk her freedom, her fortune, and her entire legacy to protect two men from an inevitable gun charge? But to understand Kim's decision, you must understand the unwritten, ironclad laws of the Brooklyn streets that forged her. In the world of Bedford-Stuyvesant in the 1980s and 90s, the police were not viewed as protectors. They were viewed as an occupying force. The primary rule of survival drummed into the psyche of every kid on the block was absolute silence. You do not cooperate, you do not testify, you do not, under any circumstances, become a witness for the state against your own people. To violate that rule, to snitch, was to invite total excommunication, or worse, violent retribution. But for Kim, it went far deeper than fear. It was about profound, unbreakable loyalty. These men were the remnants of the junior MAFIA. They were the family that the notorious B.I.G. had built. When Biggie was murdered, D-Rock and Gouda had formed a physical and emotional wall around her. They had protected her when the industry tried to devour her. In Kim's mind, walking into a federal courthouse and handing these men over to the government would have been a betrayal of her own soul. The corporate machine had demanded she act like a ruthless CEO and cut her losses. Instead, she acted like a soldier. She fell on the grenade. She walked out of the grand jury room believing she had successfully navigated the storm. She believed she had protected her family and outsmarted the system. But the federal government does not play short-term games. They play for keeps. They already possessed the CCTV footage. They had already begun squeezing other associates, offering plea deals and reduced sentences in exchange for testimony. They were quietly, methodically building an airtight case, not for the shooting itself, but for the cover-up. While the FBI tightened the noose around Lil' Kim's neck, the other half of this manufactured corporate war was experiencing a devastating, deeply personal collapse. Foxy Brown was not celebrating the impending downfall of her rival. She was fighting a terrifying battle entirely in the dark. The record labels and the radio stations had milked the feud for every possible cent. But as the legal heat from the Hot 97 shootout intensified, the industry's attitude toward Foxy Brown began to shift. She was no longer just a profitable gladiator. She was becoming a corporate liability. Foxy was plagued by a string of aggressive legal issues. She was arrested for various altercations, her behavior becoming increasingly erratic and hostile. The media, ever ready to tear down the women it had built up, gleefully documented her arrests, painting her as an out-of-control diva incapable of handling her own fame. But the media missed the catastrophic medical reality that was destroying her from the inside out. From May 2005 to March 2006, Foxy Brown suffered a sudden, severe bout of sensorineural hearing loss. She went almost entirely deaf. Imagine the sheer suffocating terror of that diagnosis. You are a musician. Your entire livelihood, your identity, and your value to the corporate world dictate that you must be able to hear a beat, ride a rhythm, and deliver vocals with pinpoint precision. Without your hearing, you are effectively useless to the music industry. Foxy woke up to a silent world. She could not hear the studio playbacks. She could not hear the crowd. She could barely hear her own voice. She kept the condition a fiercely guarded secret for as long as she could, terrified that if the executives at Def Jam found out, they would immediately terminate her contract, CTS. She continued to make public appearances, smiling for the cameras while navigating a world of absolute silence, relying on lip reading and the physical vibrations of bass lines to guess what was happening around her. The immense psychological strain of hiding this disability, combined with the ongoing trauma of the media scrutiny and the violence surrounding her peers, contributed massively to her erratic public behavior. She was lashing out because she was terrified, isolated, and profoundly vulnerable. When the truth finally emerged and Foxy required complex, highly invasive surgeries to attempt to restore her hearing, the corporate response was brutally predictable. Def Jam, the label that had championed her when she was a profitable, aggressive teenager, looked at the balance sheets. A deaf rapper cannot tour. A deaf rapper requires expensive studio accommodations. A deaf rapper is not an efficient return on investment. They dropped her. They did not offer a graceful exit. They did not provide a support system for a young woman who had sacrificed her formative years to build their empire. They simply severed the contract and walked away. The industry had pitted her against her childhood friend, squeezed millions of dollars out of the resulting friction, and the moment her physical body failed under the pressure, they tossed her into the street. She was left entirely to her own devices, fighting to regain her hearing, her career, and her sanity, completely abandoned by the men who had orchestrated her rise. As Foxy Brown vanished into surgical recovery and industry exile, Lil' Kim's federal nightmare finally exploded into public view. In April 2004, the trap snapped shut. FBI agents officially indicted Kimberly Jones. She was arrested, fingerprinted, and frog-marched in front of the global press. She was charged with 1 count of conspiracy, 3 counts of perjury, and 3 counts of making false statements to a grand jury. The charges carried a maximum potential sentence of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. The music industry watched in stunned silence. The code of the streets had finally collided with the unforgiving machinery of the federal justice system, and the system was winning. The trial of Lil' Kim commenced in early 2005 at the Manhattan Federal Courthouse. It immediately transformed into one of the most surreal media circuses in the history of New York. Kim, refusing to be publicly broken, turned her daily arrivals at the courthouse into high-fashion events. She appeared in immaculate, tailored outfits by Marc Jacobs, Chanel, and Dolce & Gabbana. She wore oversized sunglasses and pristine heels, stepping out of black SUVs as if she were arriving at the Grammy Awards rather than a criminal trial that could end her life as she knew it. It was a staggering display of defiance, a visual insistence that the government could not strip her of her dignity. But inside the cold, sterile courtroom, the reality was a slaughterhouse. The federal prosecutors did not just rely on the grainy CCTV footage to prove that Kim had lied. They used the ultimate, most devastating weapon available to them. They broke the code of silence. The government offered plea deals, leniency, and reduced sentences to the very men Kim had risked her life to protect. Faced with the terrifying prospect of decades in a federal cell, the fierce loyalty of the Brooklyn streets evaporated. The prosecution called Antoine Banger Spain and Paul Puncho Bernardi to the witness stand. Both men were members of the junior MAFIA. Both men were supposed to be Kim's brothers. Sitting mere feet away from her, under oath, Spain and Bernardi testified for the government. They looked at the jury and explicitly confirmed that Damian Butler and Sweef Jackson were present at the Hot 97 shootout. They testified that Kim had seen them. They testified that Kim knew exactly what had happened and had deliberately lied to the grand jury to protect them. was an act of betrayal so profound it defied comprehension. Lil' Kim sat at the defense table, her face an unreadable mask of high-fashion makeup, forced to listen as the men she considered family dismantled her life piece by piece. She had put her own neck on the chopping block to save them from the federal government, and in return, they had happily handed the executioner the axe. The corporate executives had taught them that survival is a zero-sum game, and when the federal pressure became unbearable, the men threw the woman under the bus. Her defense attorneys fought desperately. They argued that Kim was terrified of retaliation. They painted a picture of a young woman manipulated by violent men, trapped in a culture where cooperating with the police was a death sentence. But the federal jury was not interested in the sociological complexities of Bedford-Stuyvesant. They were not interested in the predatory nature of the music industry that had placed her in the line of fire. They looked at the CCTV footage. They listened to the sworn testimony of her own friends. And they looked at a wealthy celebrity who had blatantly lied to a grand jury. On March 17th, 2005, the jury returned their verdict. The courtroom was suffocatingly silent as the foreman stood up. Kimberly Denise Jones was found guilty of 3 counts of perjury and 1 count of conspiracy. She was acquitted of obstruction of justice, but it was a hollow victory. The perjury convictions were federal felonies. The Queen Bee of East Coast hip-hop was officially a convicted felon facing mandatory prison time. The shockwave that hit the music industry was absolute. Until that moment, hip-hop artists had often treated the legal system as a minor inconvenience, a cost of doing business that could usually be managed with high-priced lawyers and out-of-court settlements. But the federal government had just demonstrated that no amount of platinum records, no amount of media hype, and no amount of corporate baccy, none could stop them from locking an artist in a cage. When the sentencing date arrived in July, Lil' Kim stood before the federal judge, her glamorous facade finally cracking. She wept. She pleaded for leniency, speaking about her turbulent childhood, her grief over Biggie Smalls, and her responsibilities to her family. "I testified falsely during the grand jury," she admitted to the court, her voice trembling. "It was the toughest thing I have ever had to do in my life. I'm a God-fearing good person." The judge acknowledged her difficult upbringing and her immense talent, but the federal sentencing guidelines were inflexible. Perjury strikes at the very heart of the justice system. The judge handed down the sentence, 1 year and 1 day in a federal penitentiary, followed by 3 years of probation and a substantial fine. It was a devastating blow. A year and a day in the hyper-accelerated world of the music business is an eternity. It is enough time for the public to forget you. It is enough time for the record labels to replace you with a younger, cheaper, more compliant artist. The executives who had fueled the feud, who had profited off the Hot 97 shootout, and who had relentlessly pitted her against Foxy Brown for commercial gain, were entirely absent from the courtroom. They offered no public support. They paid no legal fees. They simply adjusted their marketing strategies and moved on to the next quarter's earnings. Lil' Kim was ordered to surrender to the Federal Detention Center in Philadelphia in September 2005. She had less than 2 months to put her entire life in order. In a staggering display of work ethic and sheer desperation, she spent those final weeks recording and filming relentlessly. She released her highly acclaimed album, The Naked Truth, on the exact day she reported to prison. The album received a rare, perfect 5-mic rating from the Source magazine, the very publication that had once gleefully documented her rivalry with Foxy Brown. And it was universally hailed as a masterpiece, a raw, unflinching look at betrayal, loyalty, and survival. But she could not tour it. She could not perform it on television. She could not shoot the necessary music videos to drive global sales. The corporate machine had its perfect, critically acclaimed product, but the artist was locked in an 8x10 concrete cell, wearing a beige uniform, entirely silenced by the state. The guilty verdict in that Manhattan courthouse served as the final brutal punctuation mark on a corporate tragedy. Lil' Kim traded her freedom for a loyalty that was never reciprocated, discovering too late that the code of the streets is often just a fast track to a federal cell. Foxy Brown, battling the terrifying isolation of sudden deafness, was similarly discarded by her label the moment she stopped being a viable asset, her erratic unraveling eventually landing her in Rikers Island by 2007. The media had promised the world a victor in this manufactured gladiator match, but there was no throne. There was only a trap. The two women who had violently kicked down the doors of a patriarchal industry were ultimately crushed by it. The true victors remained in the shadows. Hot 97 swept up the shattered glass and enjoyed an unprecedented ratings surge, while Bad Boy and Def Jam simply diverted their budgets to younger, cheaper talent. The tragedy of Lil' Kim and Foxy Brown remains a terrifying forensic autopsy of corporate greed, a machine that extracts trauma, converts it into capital, and discards the human remains without a second thought.